You wake to the sound of chapel bells echoing through stone corridors, their bronze voices calling the faithful to morning prayers. Your bare feet touch cold marble as you hurry through the Alcazar, carrying a basin of rosewater and fresh linen. The air tastes of incense and something else, something sour and organic that makes your stomach turn. You pause outside the royal chambers, listening to the Queen's voice through the heavy oak doors. She is praying again, as she has been for hours. And when you finally enter, you see her kneeling before a massive crucifix, still wearing the same white linen shift she donned months ago. The fabric, once pure as fresh snow, now bears yellow stains of sweat, brown patches of blood, and darker stains you dare not contemplate. The smell hits you like a physical blow. The year is 1491, and this is Isabella Ye of Castile, the most powerful woman in Christendom. And according to legend, she has made a vow that will nearly bring plague to Spain. Before we descend into this forgotten world of faith and filth, I'd love to know, where are you listening from? It absolutely fascinates me that we're exploring these buried truths together from different corners of the world, connected across centuries by our shared need to understand what people were truly capable of. The story you've just entered walks a razor's edge between myth and memory. For over 500 years, a persistent legend has clung to Isabella's name like the stains on that linen shift, that she vowed never to change her undergarments until Granada, the last Muslim stronghold in Spain, fell to Christian forces. The siege lasted 8 months, and supposedly so did her unwashed undergarments. Some versions claim she wore the same shift for 10 years. Others insist it was a different Spanish queen entirely, perhaps one of the later Habsburg monarchs known for their religious extremism and physical peculiarities. The details shift like sand, but the core image remains, a powerful woman driven by fanatical piety, living in filth that would make a peasant recoil. Modern historians largely dismiss this as propaganda, a way to either sanctify Isabella as a martyr or vilify her as an extremist, depending on who was telling the story. But the fact that such a tale could emerge, spread, and survive for centuries reveals something far more disturbing than whether it's literally true. It opens a window into a world where the line between holiness and horror was impossibly thin, where the most powerful people on earth lived in conditions that would horrify us today, and where deliberate self-degradation was not madness but devotion. To understand why this myth feels so believable, we must descend into the medieval mind and examine the strange, twisted relationship between dirt, divinity, and power in late 15th century Spain. Isabella's Spain was a land caught between worlds. For 7 centuries, Christian kingdoms had been pushing Muslim rulers south in a campaign called the Reconquista, a religious war that shaped every aspect of daily life, including the most intimate details of personal hygiene. And here's where the story becomes fascinating, because the two civilizations had radically different relationships with cleanliness. In the Islamic kingdoms of Al-Andalus, bathing was both religious obligation and social ritual. Public bathhouses called hammams dotted every major city. Muslims washed 5 times daily before prayers. The Quran explicitly praised cleanliness as half of faith. These bathhouses were architectural marvels, domed chambers filled with heated pools where people would spend hours soaking, scrubbing, socializing. The water channeled through ingenious systems of pipes and aqueducts, many dating back to Roman times, but in the Christian kingdoms that would become Spain, bathing carried a terrible stigma. Church authorities viewed public baths as dens of sin, places where naked bodies mingled in steamy darkness, where the boundaries between male and female, noble and commoner, dissolved in the democratic embrace of hot water. Worse still, bathing was associated with Islam, Judaism, and paganism, all enemies of the true faith. Saint Jerome, one of the early church fathers, had declared, "He who is bathed in Christ has no need of a second bath." This became the theological foundation for centuries of Christian uncleanliness. To wash the body was to wash away the protection of baptism, to invite demons into pores left vulnerable by soap and water. The truly holy, it was believed, should smell like martyrs, of blood, sweat, and sacred suffering. Isabella grew up in this world of sanctified filth. Born in 1451 in the town of Madrigal de las Altas Torres, she was the daughter of John II of Castile and Isabella of Portugal. Her childhood was marked by civil war, political intrigue, and the constant threat of assassination. In such an environment, personal hygiene ranked far below personal survival. The royal court was a mobile city of thousands. Nobles, servants, guards, horses, dogs, all traveling together in a vast caravan that moved from castle to castle, consuming local resources before moving on like locusts. Imagine the smell. Unwashed bodies pressed together in great halls, chamber pots overflowing with waste, rotting food scraps thrown to packs of feral dogs, horses relieving themselves wherever they stood. This was not poverty or neglect. This was normalcy for the most powerful family in Spain. In the winter of 1468, when Isabella was just 17, she witnessed something that would shape her understanding of cleanliness forever. An outbreak of plague struck the court while it was staying at the Alcazar of Segovia. The disease began, as it always did, with the rats. They emerged from the walls in broad daylight, stumbling and falling, their fur matted with blood and pus. Then came the fleas, clouds of them, desperately seeking new hosts as their rodent carriers died. Within days, the first humans began to show symptoms: fever, chills, and the characteristic buboes, swollen lymph nodes that could grow as large as apples, filled with black blood and corruption. Isabella watched as her own servants fell ill, their bodies covered in dark spots that gave the plague its name. She saw strong men reduced to whimpering children, calling for their mothers as they died in pools of their own waste. The court physicians, dressed in their bizarre beak-like masks filled with aromatic herbs, were helpless. They prescribed bleeding, purging, and prayer. But death came regardless. And here's what struck Isabella most powerfully. The plague seemed to spare the dirtiest members of the court. The kitchen servants, covered in grease and food scraps, remained healthy. The stable boys who slept with the horses and never bathed showed no signs of illness. But the nobles who occasionally washed their hands and faces died in alarming numbers. This observation, though based on coincidence rather than causation, would reinforce Isabella's growing belief that cleanliness was not just unnecessary, but potentially dangerous. The truly faithful, she concluded, should trust in God's protection, rather than worldly remedies like soap and water. The religious context made this logic seem not just reasonable, but divinely inspired. The late 15th century was an era of intense mysticism in Spanish Christianity. Saints like Catherine of Siena and Francis of Assisi were celebrated for their deliberate embrace of filth and degradation. Catherine reportedly drank pus from the wounds of plague victims. Francis never washed his hands after touching lepers. These saints weren't mentally ill by medieval standards. They were following a sophisticated theological tradition that viewed the body as a prison for the soul, a source of temptation that must be mortified and suppressed. To care for the body, to wash it, perfume it, adorn it, was the sin of vanity, placing physical comfort above spiritual salvation. This philosophy reached its extreme form in the practice of self-flagellation, which Isabella embraced with terrifying enthusiasm. 3 times weekly, she would lock herself in her private chapel, stripped to the waist, and use a whip made of knotted cords to beat her back and shoulders until blood ran down her skin, mixing with the accumulated dirt and sweat of weeks without bathing. The physical pain was only part of the ritual. By making her body a source of agony rather than pleasure, Isabella believed she was drawing closer to Christ, who had suffered on the cross for humanity's sins. The blood that dried on her skin was not just evidence of devotion, it was a protective barrier against temptation. Her undergarments, the linen shifts that lay closest to her skin, became repositories of this sanctified suffering. They absorbed not just her blood, but her sweat, her tears, and the various oils and secretions of her unwashed body. Over time, these garments took on an almost mystical significance. They were not just clothing, but relics, physical manifestations of her spiritual journey. The specific myth about Isabella's underwear vow relates to the siege of Granada, which began in April 1491. This was to be the final battle of the Reconquista, the ultimate test of Christian faith against Islamic resistance. As Isabella prepared for what she knew would be a lengthy campaign, she reportedly made a vow before the altar of the Cathedral of Córdoba. She would not change her linen shift until Granada fell to Christian forces. Whether this vow was actually made is impossible to verify, but it reflects the mindset of the time. Medieval Christians frequently made such bargains with God, promising to endure specific hardships in exchange for divine favor. These vows were considered binding contracts, enforceable by the threat of eternal damnation. The siege itself was a masterpiece of medieval warfare. Rather than attempting to storm Granada's massive walls, Isabella and her husband Ferdinand chose to starve the city into submission. They built a new city called Santa Fe just outside Granada's walls, complete with churches, markets, and administrative buildings. From this base, they slowly tightened the noose around the Muslim stronghold. For 8 months, Isabella lived in Santa Fe, directing the siege and maintaining the morale of her troops. If she had indeed made a vow not to change her undergarments, the physical and psychological toll would have been immense. The Spanish spring and summer were brutally hot, with temperatures reaching over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The air was thick with dust, smoke from cooking fires, and the smell of thousands of unwashed soldiers. Contemporary accounts describe Isabella during this period as increasingly gaunt and hollow-eyed, her face marked by an otherworldly intensity. She spent most of her time in prayer, often standing for hours before a portable altar in her tent. Visitors reported that she emanated a strange odor, not entirely unpleasant, but distinctly organic, like old leather mixed with dried flowers. The fleas that supposedly infested her clothing would have been more than just a nuisance. In the medieval understanding of disease, fleas were not just pests but potential vectors of supernatural corruption. They were associated with the devil, who was often depicted as emerging from hell covered in bites. To harbor fleas was to invite demonic influence, yet Isabella seemed to welcome them as instruments of divine testing. The psychological effects of prolonged unwashing went beyond mere discomfort. Medieval physicians, following ancient Greek theories, believed that the body's natural oils and secretions were essential for maintaining the balance of the 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. To wash these substances away was to invite illness and madness. Isabella's behavior during the siege suggests she may have been experiencing what modern psychiatrists would recognize as religious psychosis. She reported frequent visions of saints and angels. She claimed to hear divine voices directing her military strategy. She became increasingly paranoid about the loyalty of her advisors. Her refusal to change her undergarments may have been both cause and symptom of this mental state. But here's what makes the story truly disturbing. Throughout the Iberian Peninsula, such behavior wasn't just accepted, it was admired. Stories circulated of holy women who had achieved sainthood through deliberate self-abasement. Maria de Santo Domingo reportedly never washed her hands for 30 years, claiming that cleanliness was spiritual weakness. Another mystic, Catalina de Cardona, was said to have worn the same hair shirt for 40 years until it became so encrusted with blood and dirt that it could stand upright on its own. The Spanish Inquisition, established by Isabella herself in 1478, actively promoted this ideology. Those who bathed regularly, changed their clothes frequently, or showed other signs of concern for bodily comfort were suspected of being crypto-Muslims or crypto-Jews, secretly practicing the cleanliness rituals of their ancestral faiths. The focus on undergarments in the Isabella myth reflects the medieval understanding of linen as a magical substance. Unlike wool or silk, which came from animals, linen was made from flax plants and was considered pure and holy. It was the fabric of angels, the material from which burial shrouds were made. To wear linen next to the skin was to create a protective barrier against evil. But this protective power was believed to increase with time and use. Fresh linen was spiritually neutral, but linen that had absorbed the wearer's sweat, blood, and other bodily fluids became charged with their life force. The longer such garments were worn, the more powerful they became. This belief explains why medieval saints often wore the same linen shifts for decades, treating them as holy relics. If Isabella had indeed worn the same shift for 8 months during the siege, it would have been considered one of the most powerful relics in Christendom. The siege of Granada finally ended on January 2, 1492, when the Muslim leader Boabdil surrendered the city to Isabella and Ferdinand. According to the myth, this was the moment when Isabella finally changed her undergarments after 8 months of continuous wear. The garments she removed were supposedly so stiff with accumulated filth that they could stand upright without support, like armor made from human secretions. Whether this detail is true may be less important than what it reveals about the world that created it. The same religious fervor that supposedly drove Isabella to wear unwashed undergarments would soon drive her to spread Christianity to the Americas. Just 8 months after Granada fell, Christopher Columbus would depart on his voyage to the New World, funded by Isabella's crown. The consequences would reshape entire continents. The Inquisition she established would torture and execute thousands in the name of religious purity. The cultural campaign she waged against Muslim and Jewish cleanliness practices would echo through Spanish society for centuries. The myth also reflects the paradoxical relationship between power and purity. For a queen to deliberately degrade herself through extreme uncleanliness was, counterintuitively, a demonstration of ultimate authority. Only someone with absolute power could afford to appear so powerless. Only someone whose position was unassailable could risk such vulnerability. By making her body repulsive through neglect, Isabella created a protective barrier that allowed her to function as a political leader without being reduced to a sexual object. The gendered dimension is crucial. In medieval society, women's bodies were seen as inherently dirty and dangerous, sources of temptation that required constant control. For a woman to embrace this dirtiness deliberately was to take ownership of her supposed corruption, to transform it from shame into power. Contemporary accounts from foreign ambassadors described the Spanish court as uniquely malodorous, even by medieval standards. The Venetian ambassador, Pietro Martire d'Anghiera, wrote in 1491 that approaching the Spanish royal presence required great fortitude of spirit and strong stomach. The French envoy Philippe de Comines noted that Spanish nobles seemed to wear their unwashed estate as a badge of honor. This cultural acceptance of extreme uncleanliness had consequences that extended far beyond personal comfort. The Spanish court became a breeding ground for diseases that were rare in other European kingdoms. Skin conditions, intestinal parasites, respiratory infections flourished in an environment where basic hygiene was actively discouraged. The fleas that supposedly lived in Isabella's clothing were not just a personal affliction, but a potential public health threat. Medieval fleas were vectors for bubonic plague, and a single infested individual could trigger an epidemic that might kill thousands. Yet, Isabella survived. Whether through luck, divine intervention, or simple biological resistance, she lived to the age of 53, a respectable lifespan for the era. She died in 1504, not from disease contracted through poor hygiene, but from complications following childbirth and what historians suspect was uterine cancer. The preservation of her reputation despite these allegations speaks to the complex ways historical memory is constructed. Rather than being remembered as a fanatic, Isabella is generally celebrated as one of Spain's greatest monarchs, the queen who united the country and launched its golden age. The myth of her unwashed undergarments has become a footnote rather than the central theme of her story. This selective memory reflects the ongoing power of institutions to shape historical narratives. Stories that might damage Isabella's reputation are downplayed or dismissed as propaganda. Those that enhance her spiritual authority are preserved and sometimes embellished. The result is a sanitized version of history that obscures the stranger, more disturbing aspects of medieval life. But in the shadows of those sanitized narratives, something darker persists. As dawn breaks over the Alhambra in Granada, 5 centuries after Isabella's triumph, the morning light reveals a city transformed. The fountains that once fed Islamic baths now water Christian gardens. The geometric patterns that adorned the walls have been replaced by crosses and saints. The call to prayer that echoed from minarets has been silenced forever, replaced by the tolling of church bells. Yet, if you listen carefully in those ancient palaces, you can still hear something, the whisper of fabric against skin. The bells of Granada toll the hour, and somewhere in the wind that moves through those ancient halls, you can still smell it. Not perfume or roses or the clean scent of soap, but something older, something human. The accumulated weight of 8 months, or 8 years, or 8 centuries of faith and filth and the terrible, beautiful things we're capable of believing.